It was the kind of night when the world outside felt as heavy as the thoughts weighing down on Sarah's chest. The rain hammered against the diner's windows as if trying to match the beat of her anxious heart. Inside, the quiet was deafening. The small diner, once a warm gathering place, now felt like a ghost of its former self. Just a handful of tables were filled each day, and even fewer came by on stormy nights like this one. It wasn't supposed to be like this. 5 years ago, when Sarah had opened the diner with her late husband's dream in mind, it had been filled with laughter and the scent of home-cooked meals. Now, those same scents lingered, but the laughter was gone, replaced with the constant, unrelenting worry of unpaid bills. Sarah stood behind the counter, wiping down the already spotless surface. Her hands trembled slightly as she stacked the bills in front of her, her eyes scanning the numbers that never seemed to add up. The diner had become her entire world after losing her husband to a sudden accident. It was the one thing that had tied her to him, the one thing she could hold on to. And now, with the bills piling higher and the bank threatening to take it all away, she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going. She glanced at the corner where a picture of her family sat. Her late husband's smile, their daughter Lily's bright eyes, and their son, Matt, always ready with a mischievous grin. Her heart ached. They needed this place, just as much as she did. But the thought of losing the diner, of losing the dream she had shared with her husband, made it almost unbearable to think about. With a sigh, Sarah ran her fingers over the worn leather of her husband's watch. It had once been a symbol of everything they had built together. It was still in the same place on the shelf where he had left it that fateful night. She had promised herself never to sell it. But tonight, looking at the stack of overdue bills, the thought lingered. Maybe it was the only way to stay afloat. She was so deep in thought, she didn't even hear the bell above the door chime. But just as Sarah considered selling the watch, an unexpected visitor walked in, drenched from the rain, and everything began to change. Stick around, because what happens next is a game changer, and you won't want to miss it. If you're enjoying the story so far, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more heartwarming tales that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second drawing Sarah closer to the moment when she would have to make her toughest decision. With no one else in the diner, she was almost ready to close for the night. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up, and the rain slashed against the windows like 1,000 tiny hammers. Sarah stood near the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, lost in thought. She glanced at the empty chairs and sighed, wondering how long she could keep holding on. But just as she was about to turn off the lights, the bell above the door rang. The sound was sharp in the otherwise quiet diner. Sarah's gaze snapped toward the door, where a man had just stepped inside, water pooling at his feet. He looked like he'd walked straight through the storm, drenched from head to toe. His grey overcoat clung to his thin frame, and his hat, now soaked, hung loosely in his hands. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking around the diner, as though unsure of what to do next. Sarah froze, unsure herself. She hadn't expected anyone else to come in tonight. "Can I help you?" she called out, forcing a smile as she stepped forward. Her voice was steady, but her mind was racing. Would she need to turn him away? Her heart weighed heavy at the thought of losing even one more potential customer. The man looked up at her with tired eyes, as though seeing her for the first time. A weak smile tugged at his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was something in those eyes, an exhaustion, a weariness, that Sarah recognized all too well. I don't need anything," he muttered, his voice quiet and hoarse. Just trying to stay out of the rain for a bit. Sarah studied him for a moment. She could see the lines on his face, deepened by time and hardship. His clothes, though not expensive, were well worn and showed signs of a long journey. There was a fragility about him, a vulnerability that made Sarah's heart tighten. She hesitated. Offering food to a stranger wasn't something she'd done often, especially now when every penny counted. But something in his quiet presence, in the way he stood there, made her change her mind. "Why don't you have a seat?" she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'll make you something warm. It's the least I can do." The man seemed surprised. He opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, but then closed it again, nodding gratefully. He moved slowly to one of the corner tables, sitting down carefully, as though every movement took effort. His clothes left small puddles on the floor. But Sarah didn't mind. She was used to the messes of life, the stains and the struggles that couldn't be wiped away with a rag. Sarah didn't know why she was offering him a meal. Her diner's profits were thin, and her own bills were stacked higher than she could handle. But as she watched him settle into the chair, his hands trembling slightly, something in her refused to let him go without food. The kindness felt like an instinct, something her grandmother would have done without hesitation. She moved behind the counter, quickly surveying the kitchen. A bowl of soup and some bread was what she could offer. Simple, but nourishing. She set to work, stirring the pot of chicken soup she had prepared earlier that afternoon, then slicing a fresh loaf of bread to accompany it. As she worked, she could hear the man shifting in his seat, his eyes now cast out the window, watching the rain. It wasn't until the soup was ready and she had placed it in front of him, along with the bread, that he spoke again. "You're too kind," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached for the spoon, his hands still shaking slightly. "I didn't expect this." Sarah smiled, though it felt heavy in her chest. "No one should go hungry, especially on a night like this," she replied, her voice quiet. "Please, eat. I know it's not much, but it's something." The man nodded slowly, his eyes brightening as he took his first spoonful. He closed his eyes for a moment, savouring the taste. Sarah stood a few steps away, leaning against the counter, giving him space. There was something tender about watching him eat, the way he seemed to appreciate each bite as if it was a luxury, though it was only a simple meal. As he ate, Sarah continued with her tasks, but her attention remained on him. The diner was empty, save for the two of them, and the silence between them was comfortable, almost peaceful. It wasn't often that Sarah had the chance to sit and watch someone enjoy the food she prepared. Most of her customers barely took the time to appreciate it, always in a hurry to leave. She found herself wondering about the man. What had brought him to her diner, soaking wet and without a word to ask for help? What had he gone through in his life to end up here, in the middle of a storm, with nowhere else to turn? He noticed her gaze and looked up, his eyes meeting hers. There was no shame in his expression, just an odd sort of quiet gratitude. He took another spoonful of soup before speaking again. "I'm Frank," he said simply, as if that small piece of information meant little. "I used to work in construction, until my health gave out. Spent the last of my savings on treatments, and now I'm just trying to get by." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, but he quickly cleared his throat. "I didn't know where else to go. I saw your diner, and I don't know. I just walked in." Sarah listened intently, her heart aching for him. There was something raw in his words, something that reminded her of her own struggles. She wasn't used to hearing about others in the same way. But in that moment, Frank's quiet confession made her feel less alone. He finished his meal quietly, the storm outside still raging. Sarah didn't rush him, even though she knew it was getting late. When he was done, Frank placed his spoon gently back into the bowl, his gaze fixed on it for a long moment. He took a deep breath, and Sarah watched, sensing that something was about to change. He slowly stood up, his movements deliberate and calm. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but steady. "I didn't expect this. People don't do this for each other anymore." Sarah smiled softly. "Sometimes, we just need a little kindness." Frank nodded, his eyes meeting hers once more before he turned toward the door. But just before he stepped outside, he paused, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper and placed it on the table, next to his empty bowl. Without a word, he stepped into the rain, disappearing into the night. What he left behind was something Sarah would never forget. But she had no idea how much that simple act of kindness would change her life. Sarah stood in the quiet diner, the weight of the evening's events settling over her like a thick fog. The sound of the storm outside had faded into the background, but her mind was racing. She had barely processed Frank's sudden appearance. And now, with the stranger gone, her focus shifted to the small, crumpled piece of paper he had left behind. It sat on the table where he had eaten, next to the empty bowl, its edges worn from being carried around. The paper was a simple thing, nothing fancy, folded in a way that spoke of hurried hands. Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should even touch it, but curiosity won out, and she carefully unfolded the paper. At first glance, it seemed like any other thank you note, a brief expression of gratitude. But as she read through the words, she found herself confused. "Meet me at the old office building on 5th Street. Midnight. The key will be waiting for you. Do not share this with anyone." Her fingers gripped the paper tighter as she reread it. What was this all about? Frank had seemed so ordinary, his story so humble. Yet now he had left behind something that felt anything but ordinary. The mention of a meeting, an old office building, and a key. None of it made sense. Why would he leave her such a strange note after a simple meal? The words seemed to echo in her head over and over, each phrase wrapping around her thoughts like a puzzle she had to solve. She could almost feel the weight of the instructions pressing on her chest, urging her to act. But Sarah wasn't the type of person to be swept away by mystery. She liked things simple, predictable. And yet, this note felt like an invitation, a call to something bigger, even if she didn't understand it. Her mind raced. What was she supposed to do? She glanced at the clock. It was nearing 9 p.m., and the diner was long past closing time. She had been running this place for years, always taking care of business first. But tonight, the business of the diner felt insignificant compared to the message in her hands. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to crumple the paper and throw it away. But another part of her, one she didn't fully understand, felt an inexplicable pull to follow the instructions, to see where this odd twist of fate would lead. She walked slowly to the counter, pacing as she thought it through. The office building on 5th Street wasn't far from here. She had passed it countless times, never paying much attention to it. The building was old, run down, with broken windows and peeling paint. No one had occupied it for years, and it seemed like just another relic of a forgotten time. Her instincts screamed at her to stay safe, to forget the note, and go on with her life. But there was something about Frank's presence, his quiet desperation, that made her feel like she had to at least try. Maybe, just maybe, this would explain the strange encounter. Before she could change her mind, Sarah grabbed her coat from the back of the diner. It wasn't the kind of decision she would typically make. She had a young daughter, and reckless behavior was something she couldn't afford. But tonight, she felt a need to follow through. It was as if something bigger than herself was at play, pulling her toward that meeting. She grabbed her keys and headed out into the night. The rain had slowed, but the air was still thick with the remnants of the storm. The city was quieter now, its streets damp and glistening under the flickering streetlights. As Sarah walked toward Fifth Street, her steps echoed in the empty streets, the only sound apart from the distant hum of the city. The office building loomed ahead, its dark silhouette rising against the sky. It looked even more abandoned up close. The windows dark, the door locked tight with a heavy iron bar across it. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she approached. She had never been inside, never thought anyone would want to be here. It was the kind of place people avoided, forgotten, left to decay. Her hand trembled slightly as she approached the door, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. The street was empty, and the night seemed to swallow up all sound. The only thing she could hear was the thudding of her own heartbeat. She placed her hand on the cold metal of the door, half expecting it to open on its own. But it didn't. She looked down at the note again, searching for a clue, something she might have missed. Then her eyes landed on a small, faint marking at the bottom of the paper, a symbol, almost imperceptible at first glance. It was a simple key, drawn in delicate ink. She had overlooked it earlier, but now she realized it was the key she was meant to find. With a deep breath, she turned the paper over in her hands, looking for something, anything, that would explain more. But the back was blank, offering no further answers. The note had told her to go to the building. Now she was here. The key. The meeting. As she stood frozen in front of the building, Sarah wondered what Frank's intentions were. Who was he really? What was all this about? Her thoughts spiraled. She had been doing her best to keep her life together, to manage her diner and care for her daughter. She hadn't expected to be caught up in some kind of mysterious, half-baked adventure. But here she was, and there was no turning back. With a surge of determination, she stepped toward the side of the building, where a narrow alley ran between two crumbling walls. It was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single flickering lamp on the corner. As she reached the alley's end, her gaze fell upon something unexpected. A small metal box, wedged into a crack in the stone wall. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it, the key. The box was about the size of a shoebox, with a small keyhole at the front. She approached it slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for the latch. It was a strange, eerie moment, standing in the darkness, surrounded by the ruins of an old office building, about to unlock something she couldn't explain. What she would find inside that box would change everything. The small metal box clicked open with a soft metallic sound, and Sarah's heart raced in anticipation. She wasn't sure what she had expected to find, but the contents of the box took her by surprise. It wasn't gold or jewelry, as her mind had briefly wandered to imagine. Instead, it was a plain file, thick with paper, yellowing at the edges. The weight of it felt significant, like a relic from another time. With trembling fingers, Sarah lifted the file from the box and sat down on the cold ground beside it. The building around her was eerily silent, and the only noise came from the occasional drip of water as the remnants of the storm leaked through cracks in the walls. She glanced around briefly before focusing on the file in her hands. The cover was simple, marked only with the words, "Historical Records, Golden Oak Diner." Sarah's breath caught at the sight of the name. Golden Oak was the name of her diner, but she had never seen it written in such formal letters. She had always thought of her diner as a modest, humble place, nothing more than a small corner restaurant in a struggling neighborhood. She had never imagined it was connected to something bigger. Opening the file, she immediately found documents that told the story of a different time, a time when Golden Oak was part of a thriving restaurant chain. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, financial statements, and photographs of lavish restaurants in grand buildings, places that were far removed from her small diner. The images showed bustling dining rooms, elegant decor, and smiling faces of people who seemed to have no care in the world. It was hard to reconcile these images with the empty seats and faded signs that now defined her diner. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the names listed in the documents. There were mentions of corporate mergers, high-profile chefs, and investors. People who had once believed in the potential of Golden Oak, believing it to be the crown jewel of a national restaurant chain. It was a story she had never heard before. The more she read, the more astonished she became. This wasn't just a diner. This was part of a legacy, a piece of history that had been buried for years. And then she came across a piece of information that made her hands freeze. It was a photograph, yellowed and worn from age, showing a family standing together in front of a much grander version of the Golden Oak Diner. The people in the photo were dressed in elegant suits, smiling at the camera. A tall, proud man stood at the center, his face stern, but somehow filled with quiet authority. Next to him was a woman, elegant and poised, with a soft expression. Behind them, a young man stood, his face turned slightly away from the camera, his posture stiff. The caption underneath the photo read, "The founding family of Golden Oak Diner, Samuel and Evelyn Montgomery, with their son, Frank Montgomery." Sarah's mind swirled. The name Montgomery had a heavy weight to it. It was a name associated with power, influence, and wealth. How was it possible that the man who had sat in her diner just hours ago, Frank, was the son of these people? The son of the very family who had built this once prominent restaurant chain? The pieces began to fall into place, but the picture was still blurry. Frank was the estranged son of Samuel and Evelyn Montgomery. But why had he been estranged? And more importantly, why had he come to her diner of all places? The questions piled up in her mind, each one leading to another, but she couldn't yet see the full picture. She turned the page, desperate to understand more. The next set of documents chronicled the downfall of the Montgomery family's empire. There were mentions of financial mismanagement, shady business deals, and a major scandal that had rocked the restaurant world. According to the records, Golden Oak had been forced to close several of its locations, and the Montgomerys had lost everything in the process. The bankruptcy was sudden, a devastating blow that left the family in ruins. But there was more. As Sarah read, she learned that Frank's father, Samuel Montgomery, had been accused of embezzling large sums of money from the company's accounts. The scandal had destroyed the family's reputation and shattered their once thriving business. Frank, the young man in the photograph, had been just a teenager when it all came crashing down. The records mentioned that Frank had disappeared shortly after the scandal broke, vanishing without a trace. For a long time, no one knew what had happened to him. Rumors swirled that he'd changed his name and moved far away to escape the shame of his family's legacy. And now, here he was, sitting in her diner, leaving her a cryptic note and leading her to a forgotten file in an abandoned building. Sarah couldn't make sense of it. The connection between Frank and the Montgomery family was undeniable, but it didn't explain why he had sought her out. Was it because of the diner's past? Or had Frank come back for something else? something more personal. The file was heavy in her hands, filled with the weight of history and lost opportunity. She closed it, the answers she was seeking still just beyond her grasp. But one thing was clear. Frank's past was tangled up with her diner's history in ways she had never imagined. And as much as she wanted to understand it, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping over her. The truth, whatever it was, had the potential to change everything. She tucked the file under her arm and stood up, suddenly feeling the weight of the night pressing down on her. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried a chill. Sarah looked around one last time, the quiet, abandoned office building standing like a silent sentinel in the night. She needed to go home, to think, to process everything she had just uncovered. But as she turned to leave, something in the back of her mind nagged at her. Frank hadn't just left her a note, a file, or a meeting. He had left her with a question, one that she had to answer before she could move forward. What had brought him back after all these years? What did he want from her? And how was her diner tied to the downfall of the Montgomery family? As she stepped back into the rain-soaked streets, Sarah knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. She had opened a door she couldn't close. And wherever it led, she would have to follow. The key felt heavier in Sarah's hand than it had before. She hadn't given it much thought at first, but now, as she made her way back to the abandoned office, she couldn't help but wonder what it was meant to unlock. She had hoped for clarity, but all she had gotten so far was confusion. Frank had left her so many questions, each one tangled with another, and she was beginning to wonder whether this whole journey was leading somewhere. Somewhere she wasn't sure she wanted to go. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still slick with water, reflecting the streetlights in soft pools of gold. She made her way back to the office building, the key tucked in her coat pocket. The place felt even more desolate in the quiet night, and as she stepped inside, the familiar scent of dust and neglect filled her nose. The office still held the ghostly remnants of a once busy workplace, the walls adorned with yellowed papers and cracked wooden furniture. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the small locked drawer in the corner. It was the one Frank's note had mentioned, the one that the key was supposed to open. Her fingers shook slightly as she inserted the key into the lock. The click echoed in the silent room, and she pushed open the drawer with anticipation. Inside, she found something completely unexpected. Rather than the usual documents or receipts, there were 2 rolled-up blueprints, carefully secured with rubber bands, and a leather-bound folder. The folder, which had a glossy finish despite the dust, was heavy. Sarah's curiosity grew as she picked it up and opened it, revealing pages filled with detailed plans for a diner. The first blueprint was for a modernized version of her diner, but it wasn't just any renovation plan. It was an entire redesign. The layout was sleek and contemporary, with wider seating areas, a larger kitchen, and a new facade that matched the upscale vibe of the larger restaurant chains. But what struck Sarah the most was how familiar it felt. The design wasn't just about bringing in more customers. It was about creating a space that had the warmth and welcoming atmosphere that had always been the heart of Golden Oak Diner. It felt like a vision, someone's idea of what her diner could become. But it was also an idea that deeply resonated with Sarah's own dreams. She had always hoped to improve the diner, to make it stand out in a way that honored her husband's memory and kept their dream alive. But she had never had the means to do so. Now, it seemed, someone else had already envisioned it for her. As Sarah unfurled the second blueprint, she found a detailed proposal for how to make it happen. The proposal didn't just cover the building and design, it included financial strategies, marketing plans, and even staff training programs. It was a comprehensive, well-thought-out approach to reinvigorating the diner, with careful attention to both its legacy and its future. The proposal even suggested partnerships with local suppliers to ensure the quality of food and service would remain at the heart of the diner's success. But it was the letter that followed the blueprints that caught Sarah off guard. She had assumed it was a generic business letter, but as she began to read, she realized it was written specifically to her. The letter, penned in neat handwriting, explained everything. "Dear Sarah, I've watched you for a while, and I must say I'm impressed by your dedication. Your passion for quality and community is evident in everything you do. I see how you fight every day to keep the diner running, how you give so much of yourself to make it a place where people feel at home. You've preserved the heart of what Golden Oak once was, and it's clear to me that you're the person who can carry it into the future. I know it may seem strange that I'm contacting you like this, but I believe in your potential, in your ability to restore what was lost. The diner holds more than just sentimental value. It's part of a legacy that I'm determined to restore. My family built this business, but it's been buried under years of shame and misfortune. I want to right the wrongs and rebuild what we lost. You and your diner are the key to making that happen. Please consider this proposal as an invitation, not just to invest, but to join me in reviving the Golden Oak legacy. Together, we can turn this place into something extraordinary. Sincerely, Frank Montgomery." As Sarah read the letter, she felt a mixture of awe and confusion. Frank hadn't just been a stranger who stumbled into her diner. He had been watching her, studying her every move. It was clear now that he had an agenda, a purpose that was tied to his family's past. But what did he want from her? Was this truly a partnership, or was there something more he expected from her in return? The proposal laid out the possibility of a complete overhaul of the diner, transforming it into something more modern, more profitable, and more in line with the vision of the Montgomery family. But it also came with risks. Sarah had worked so hard to keep the diner afloat, and handing over control to someone else, even someone like Frank, was a huge leap of faith. For a moment, Sarah simply sat in the silence, letting the weight of the decision settle over her. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, each beat like a reminder of what was at stake. The diner had been her lifeline after her husband's death, her connection to the past, and the future she had hoped for. But was Frank's offer an opportunity or a trap? Was he truly interested in reviving his family's legacy, or was he just using her diner as a stepping stone for his own agenda? The more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized that there was no easy answer. Frank's plan had a certain logic to it, but it also raised more questions than it answered. If she agreed to work with him, would she be giving up control of her dream? Would she lose the very thing that had kept her going all these years? She closed the letter slowly, her mind racing with thoughts and possibilities. The decision she was about to make would determine not just the future of her diner, but the future of her own life. The key Frank had given her wasn't just a symbol of the past. It was a key to her future, a future she had to choose for herself. For now, though, Sarah knew she needed to think it through. There was no rush. She had always prided herself on her ability to make careful decisions, and this one, perhaps more than any other, required that same careful thought. But one thing was clear. Her life, her diner, and her future were about to change in ways she couldn't yet understand. With the blueprints and proposal in her hands, Sarah made her way back out into the night, the cool air biting at her skin. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside her mind was far from over. The morning after Sarah's discovery in the office was quiet, almost too quiet. The streets outside her diner were still slick from the previous night's rain, and the air had a crispness that made it feel like a fresh start. But inside, the weight of the decision she had to make still lingered. She hadn't slept much, tossing and turning as she tried to weigh the pros and cons of Frank's offer. The blueprints, the proposal, the letter, it was all so overwhelming. For every bit of excitement it stirred in her, doubt followed closely behind. Sarah was lost in thought as she wiped down the counter, her mind replaying the events of the previous night. She'd barely had time to digest everything, and now she had this looming offer to consider. The diner's bell jingled as the door swung open, pulling her out of her reverie. She looked up, expecting a regular customer or maybe a passerby seeking shelter from the rain, but instead, a well-dressed man stepped inside. He was tall, with sharp features and a suit that looked far too expensive for a diner like hers. His presence filled the space, and Sarah felt an immediate unease. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep and polite. "I'm Edward Mallory. I represent Mr. Frank Montgomery." At the mention of Frank's name, Sarah's stomach did a flip. She hadn't expected anyone to show up at the diner so soon, let alone a lawyer. "Mr. Montgomery sent you?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I wasn't expecting—" "I understand," Edward interrupted smoothly. "I'm here with an offer. A business proposition from Mr. Montgomery himself." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had already begun to question whether Frank's intentions were genuine. The fact that his lawyer had now appeared only made things feel even more complicated. "Please, take a seat," she said, gesturing toward one of the empty booths. "What exactly is this offer?" Edward sat across from her, placing a briefcase gently on the table. He opened it, revealing several folders and papers neatly stacked inside. Sarah couldn't help but notice the weight of the situation as he pulled one file out and set it down in front of her. "Mr. Montgomery is offering to invest in your diner," Edward explained, looking at Sarah with a calm, measured expression. "He wants to bring in resources to help modernize and expand while still keeping the heart of the cafe intact. It's clear that your diner holds a special place in this community, and he wants to help it thrive." Sarah blinked in surprise. Modernize, expand. She had never imagined that someone would want to invest in her small diner, let alone someone with the resources to bring it into the future. She'd always dreamed of turning things around, but it seemed too good to be true. "That's generous," Sarah said cautiously, not quite sure where this was headed. "But why me? Why my diner? What's in it for Mr. Montgomery?" Edward smiled slightly, though his eyes remained serious. "That's the part I'm sure you'll find interesting." He reached for another folder, sliding it across the table to Sarah. "This document contains some details about Mr. Montgomery's family and their connection to this diner." Sarah raised an eyebrow as she opened the folder. The first page was a letter, addressed to her in Frank's handwriting. She recognized the familiar script and couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. But as she read, something she hadn't expected became clear. The letter was brief, but informative. It revealed that Frank's family, the Montgomerys, had once owned a chain of high-end restaurants. But after a major scandal, their empire had collapsed and their wealth had been hidden away, along with their connection to the Golden Oak Diner. "My father," the letter continued, "was once a partner in the original Golden Oak chain. After the scandal, everything was lost. our family's fortune, our name, our business. But one thing remained: the diner. Your husband, Tom, and my father were close. They shared dreams of creating a restaurant that combined the best of both worlds, quality food and a sense of community. When the company went under, the diner was left behind as a symbol of what we lost. I've been watching your efforts to preserve it, and I want to help bring back what was once ours. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she put the letter down. She hadn't known any of this. Her husband, Tom, had never mentioned a connection to the Montgomery family. But now, the pieces were starting to fall into place. Her diner, this modest little cafe, was tied to a much larger story. A story of loss, betrayal, and rebuilding. Mr. Montgomery, Edward continued, sees potential in what you've built here. He wants to help restore the legacy of Golden Oak, but on one condition. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What condition? Edward leaned forward, his tone softening. Mr. Montgomery wants the diner to remain a community hub. He insists that you preserve the focus on family, tradition, and the values that made Golden Oak special in the first place. His goal is not to turn this into another corporate restaurant, but to honor the roots of what your husband and his father started. Sarah's mind raced. The idea of revamping the diner, giving it a new life, was tempting. The thought of having the financial support to finally fix things, to modernize the space, and reach more customers, made her heart beat faster. But there was something about the way Edward spoke, something that made it clear that this offer came with strings attached. "Does Frank want anything in return?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice steady. "What's the catch?" Edward's expression remained neutral, though there was a subtle shift in his posture. Mr. Montgomery only wants one thing: your trust. He's offering this not just as an investor, but as someone who believes in the values this diner represents. He wants to restore not only the legacy of Golden Oak, but the integrity of his family's name. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling a mix of emotions swirl within her. Frank's offer was more than just financial help. It was personal. It tied her to a history she hadn't known existed, a history that was now intertwined with her future. But it also felt like a delicate balance. If she accepted, she would be putting her trust in Frank, someone who had been hidden in the shadows all this time. Would he honor his word? Or would the diner become just another business venture for someone else's gain? As Edward stood up to leave, he handed her a final document. "This is the formal offer. Should you choose to accept it?" he said, his voice leaving no room for ambiguity. "Mr. Montgomery believes in what you're doing here, Sarah. He's willing to make this work, but you'll have to decide whether you want to take that step with him." As Sarah watched Edward leave the diner, her mind was filled with questions, and her heart was torn between the possibilities. The diner had always been her husband's dream, and now it felt like a dream that might be slipping through her fingers, no matter how hard she tried to hold on. The quiet hum of the diner felt unusually loud as Sarah sat alone at the counter, her mind swirling with thoughts. The offer from Frank had left her with more questions than answers, and now, after Edward's visit, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. Frank's gesture, his desire to invest in the diner, seemed too good to be true. Everything about it, the way he'd appeared out of nowhere, the sudden offer of financial help, felt like it was part of something bigger, something she wasn't seeing. Her fingers drummed on the counter as she replayed the details of the meeting. The connection between Frank's family and the diner was undeniable, but it was also full of gaps. Why hadn't Tom ever mentioned anything about Frank or the Montgomery family? And why had Frank suddenly decided to come forward now, after all these years? There was something she was missing, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into a situation far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. Determined to find out more, Sarah decided to do some digging. She wasn't one to take things at face value, especially not when her future, her diner, her livelihood, was at stake. She spent the afternoon in the diner preparing for the evening rush, but her mind was focused on one thing: finding answers. She reached for the stack of papers Frank had left her, the ones detailing his family's history and the proposal. She'd read them all before, but this time she approached them with fresh eyes. There had to be more hidden beneath the surface. Flipping through the pages, Sarah's eyes narrowed when she came across a name she hadn't noticed before. The name was familiar, though she couldn't place it. She searched through the file until she found a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, that made her stomach churn. The headline read, "Montgomery Scandal. A family fortune lost in a web of lies." The article recounted the fall of the Montgomery family's restaurant empire, but there was more to the story than just financial ruin. There was a mention of a criminal investigation, a cover-up, and the mysterious death of a key player in the scandal. She froze as the details began to click into place. The name of the man at the center of the scandal was none other than Frank's father, Charles Montgomery. Sarah had heard rumors about a scandal years ago, but she hadn't known the specifics. Now, reading the article, she realized that the scandal had been much deeper than anyone had imagined. But what did this have to do with the diner? Sarah's heart began to race. She thought back to the conversations she'd had with Tom, the late-night talks when he would get quiet, as though there was something he wanted to say, but couldn't. Was it possible that Tom had known about the Montgomerys? Had he been involved in the same scandal, or worse, had his death been connected to it? Her mind reeled with the implications. The idea that Frank's father had been involved in such a scandal was shocking, but what troubled Sarah even more was the possibility that Tom's death might not have been as straightforward as it seemed. Could he have been involved in this web of lies? Was his death part of the larger conspiracy that Frank was trying to unravel? Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah began to research further. She scoured local archives, spoke to a few old-timers in the town who might have remembered the scandal, and even made a few discreet calls to people who might have known more about the Montgomery family's downfall. Piece by piece, the story began to come together. Frank's father, Charles, had been more than just a businessman. He had been a powerful figure in the restaurant industry. Someone whose influence stretched far beyond the kitchens and boardrooms. But when the scandal broke, an insider trading scheme that involved several key players in the restaurant industry, it all came crashing down. Charles had been implicated, though he had always denied any wrongdoing. The investigation had been messy, with accusations of corruption, bribery, and hidden funds. The public had turned against the Montgomerys, and within a matter of months, their empire was gone. Sarah's heart sank as she learned more about Charles Montgomery's downfall. She had no idea how deep the connection between the Montgomerys and her husband went. Tom had always been the quiet one, the one who kept to himself and avoided talking about his past. But now, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to be falling into place in a way that made her question everything she thought she knew. The deeper she dug, the more she uncovered. There were whispers that Tom had known about the scandal and had been working to expose it. But his efforts had come to an abrupt end when he died in that car accident, a death that, at the time, had been written off as an unfortunate accident. But now, Sarah wasn't so sure. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed like Tom's death had been part of something far more sinister, a move to silence him before he could reveal the truth. And what about Frank? Why had he waited so long to come forward? Was his offer to invest in the diner part of a larger plan to restore the Montgomery family's reputation? Or was it something else entirely? Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Frank was hiding something, that his motives weren't as pure as they appeared. But what was he really after? As the evening approached, Sarah found herself on edge. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that the diner, the place she had worked so hard to preserve, was at the center of a much larger story. A story filled with secrets, betrayals, and hidden motives. Frank's investment offer suddenly felt like a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a lifeline, a chance to save the diner and rebuild. But on the other, it could mean stepping into a world of deceit and manipulation that Sarah wasn't sure she was ready for. She had always believed in the diner's mission, to be a place where people could come together, share stories, and find comfort in a simple meal. But now, that mission seemed to be entangled in a web of lies that went back much further than she had ever imagined. Sarah closed the file with a heavy heart. She had a decision to make, one that could change everything. Would she trust Frank? Or was there more to the story than he was willing to reveal? The truth, she realized, was far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. The wind outside howled against the windows of the diner, a storm still lingering in the air. Sarah sat at the counter, her fingers absently tracing the edges of a napkin, her mind occupied with thoughts that refused to settle. She had read and reread the letter Frank had sent her, trying to see through the layers of his offer. It wasn't just a business proposal anymore. It was a lifeline, or a trap. A choice that seemed simple on the surface, but one that carried more weight than she could have ever imagined. On one hand, accepting Frank's investment could bring the changes she needed. The diner could grow, its legacy preserved, and perhaps it could even reach the level of success it once had before the decline. The idea of expanding was tempting. She had worked tirelessly to maintain the diner, but lately it felt like she was running on fumes. The mounting debts, the relentless competition from newer, flashier places, and the ever-growing list of bills. It was all too much. But as much as the offer from Frank seemed to promise relief, it came with strings attached. The thought of changing the heart of the diner, turning it into something more corporate, something less personal, gnawed at her. This diner had always been her sanctuary, her way of honouring her late husband, Tom. Every corner of it, from the worn booths to the kitchen where she had spent countless hours perfecting recipes, was a piece of him. If she took Frank's money, would she lose that? Would the essence of the place change forever? Sarah's eyes drifted to the window. The storm outside was starting to clear, but inside, her mind was still clouded with doubt. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest, the pressure of needing to choose the right path. If she refused the investment, the diner could collapse under the weight of its debts. But if she accepted it, she risked letting go of everything she'd worked so hard to create. The bell above the door jingled, and Sarah's thoughts were interrupted. She turned her head to see Edward, the lawyer, stepping into the diner, his usual calm demeanour now carrying a hint of urgency. He sat down at the counter without a word, his eyes locked on Sarah. "Any thoughts?" he asked quietly, his tone betraying the seriousness of the situation. Sarah took a deep breath, her mind swirling. "I'm just not sure," she admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. "There's so much at stake. And, Frank, I just don't know if I can trust him." Edward nodded, understanding. "I get it. This is a big decision, but you need to understand one thing. Frank's offer comes from a place of genuine interest in preserving your diner's legacy. He's not just doing this for himself." She looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Edward leaned forward, lowering his voice. There's something you don't know about Frank's involvement with the diner. Something that might change how you see things. Sarah's brow furrowed. What do you mean? He's already told me everything about the offer, about his family's connection to this place. Edward hesitated for a moment before continuing. Frank hasn't just been offering you money. He's been quietly funding this diner for months, Sarah. Using his resources to keep it open while you've been struggling, without you even knowing. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she processed what Edward was saying. Frank had been secretly helping her. All this time, when she thought she was barely scraping by, when she had no idea how she was going to make the next payment, Frank had been there, behind the scenes, propping up the diner with his money. She felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her, shock, confusion, gratitude, and something darker too. Betrayal. Why hadn't he told her? Why had he kept it a secret? Why would he do that? Sarah whispered, the question slipping from her lips before she could stop it. If he wanted to help, why didn't he just tell me? Why keep it a secret? Edward's gaze softened. I don't know the full story, but I believe he didn't want to make you feel like you were being pitied. Maybe he thought you would reject the help if you knew. But now, you have to decide whether you can accept that help, knowing it came with no strings attached. Sarah's mind raced. Frank had never asked for anything in return, never demanded recognition or a show of gratitude. The realization hit her hard. She had been so caught up in her own struggles, so focused on the survival of the diner, that she hadn't noticed the quiet gestures of kindness around her. Frank's actions had been a sign of faith in her diner, in her ability to carry on. And yet, she had almost turned her back on him, unable to see the good because she was blinded by her own fears and doubts. But now, with the knowledge of what Frank had done, everything changed. She had been given a second chance, not just to save the diner, but to rebuild it on her terms. She could expand, she could modernize, and still keep the spirit of the diner alive, if she allowed herself to trust again. You have a choice, Sarah, Edward said, breaking her from her thoughts. You can accept Frank's offer, knowing he has your back, or you can reject it and continue on your own. But remember, what Frank is offering isn't just about money. It's about preserving something important, something that goes beyond business. The words settled over her like a weight. Sarah looked down at the counter, her fingers once again tracing the familiar edges of the napkin. This was more than just a business decision. It was about trust, about allowing someone to help when you least expected it, and accepting that sometimes the greatest kindness comes in the form of quiet support, even when it's hidden behind the scenes. She stood up, her decision starting to take shape in her mind. There was still fear, still uncertainty about the future, but she wasn't alone anymore. She didn't have to carry the burden on her own. And maybe, just maybe, that was all she needed to start believing in herself again. As she walked toward the kitchen, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Frank. I hope you understand now. I'm here for you. Always. Sarah smiled softly to herself. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was ready to face it. The days that followed Sarah's decision felt like a whirlwind. What had once been a small, struggling diner now seemed to pulse with a new energy. The transformation had begun, but it wasn't just about the physical changes, new paint, modern fixtures, and an updated menu. It was about something deeper, something that tied the diner's past to its future. And Sarah wasn't going to let anything overshadow the soul of what she had built with Tom, her late husband. Sarah had made it clear to Frank, during their conversations, that that she was willing to accept his investment, but only on her terms. She would expand the diner, but she would not let it lose the heart that had made it so special. The sense of community, the family recipes passed down through generations, and the personal touch that had always made it a gathering place for everyone, from the locals to the occasional traveller. She wasn't going to let money change that. Frank had agreed, understanding her vision and her commitment to what the diner stood for. It wasn't just a business venture to her. It was a legacy, one she was determined to preserve. The first few weeks of construction and renovation were chaotic. Workers moved in and out of the diner, tearing down old walls, putting up new ones, and transforming the space into something that felt both modern and familiar. Sarah had spent long hours overseeing the progress, ensuring that every detail was perfect, from the arrangement of the booths to the way the kitchen was laid out. She even insisted on keeping the diner's original sign, the one that had hung proudly outside since the very beginning. Yet, as much as the physical space was changing, Sarah made sure the diner's soul stayed intact. She began incorporating more of her husband's original ideas, like creating a wall of framed photos from the diner's early days, showcasing the many faces of the community that had supported them over the years. Every recipe on the menu was treated with respect, and new dishes were introduced, but always with a nod to tradition. The goal was never to change what people loved, but to offer something new without losing sight of the past. Frank, for his part, had been fully supportive. He provided the resources needed to bring Sarah's vision to life, but he never once tried to push her in a direction she wasn't comfortable with. His role in the diner's revival had been more about trust than control. He trusted Sarah to make the right decisions, and in return, she trusted him to give her the space to do so. It was a partnership built on mutual respect, and it was starting to feel like a real family affair. Word began to spread about the diner's renovation. Local customers who had once turned away from the diner, assuming it was a lost cause, were starting to trickle back in, curious about the changes. Some were skeptical, unsure of what to expect, but many were pleasantly surprised to find that it still felt like home. The atmosphere was warm, inviting, and familiar, with a fresh energy that made it clear the diner had turned a new leaf. The grand reopening of the diner was a success. The place was packed, the air filled with the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation. Old regulars chatted in the corner booths, while new faces lined up at the counter, eager to taste the dishes they had heard so much about. Sarah smiled to herself, watching the room, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what she had hoped for. The diner was more than just a business now. It was a community hub, a place where people came, not just to eat, but to connect with one another. What Sarah hadn't expected was the way the diner started to bring people together in unexpected ways. She watched as strangers struck up conversations, bonds forming over shared meals and experiences. A couple that had just moved into town became fast friends with an elderly man who came in every Tuesday for his usual breakfast. A mother and daughter from out of state had lunch with a young couple who had just gotten engaged. These were the moments that made Sarah's heart swell with pride. The diner wasn't just about food. It was about the connections that happened over a meal, the friendships that blossomed, and the feeling of being part of something larger than yourself. One evening, as Sarah wiped down the counter after a long day, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Frank standing behind her, a small smile on his face. It was rare for him to drop by during business hours, but today he had made an exception. "Looks good in here," he said, glancing around the bustling diner. "You've really done something special." Sarah felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. "I couldn't have done it without your help," she said, her voice sincere. Frank shook his head. No, you did all the hard work. I was just the one who believed in you. You've built something that's not just about making money. It's about making a difference. Sarah looked out over the diner, watching the familiar faces and the new ones, and she realized how true his words were. The diner had become more than just a place to eat. It had become a sanctuary for people to gather, to share stories, and to create memories. It was a reflection of Sarah's own values, community, tradition, and the belief that, even in the toughest of times, you could make something beautiful out of the simplest things. The conversation turned to business, as it always did, but Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. She wasn't just managing a diner. She was creating something lasting, something that would outlive her and Frank and anyone else who passed through its doors. The community she had built around the diner was stronger than any investment could be. It was then that Sarah understood something important. This was her real legacy. It wasn't about the money, the renovations, or even the business itself. It was about the lives she had touched along the way, the people who had walked into her diner as strangers and left as friends. The transformation of the diner had mirrored her own journey, through the struggle, the fear, the unknown. But in the end, it had become something far greater than she could have ever imagined. As the evening wore on, Sarah stood by the counter, watching the laughter and chatter fill the room. She knew that this was just the beginning. The future was still uncertain, but she was no longer afraid. With Frank's help and the unwavering support of the community, the diner had found its place in the world again. It was where connections were made, where people found comfort in a meal, and where Sarah's vision for the future had finally come to life. Months had passed since the diner had been transformed, and Sarah's life had found a sense of stability she hadn't dared to imagine. The business was thriving, her staff was more like family, and the community had fully embraced the new version of the diner, just as she had hoped. Every day, Sarah watched the familiar faces walk through the door, each person with their own story, their own reason for seeking comfort in the warmth of the diner. Frank, however, remained a quiet presence. He would occasionally stop by, always blending into the background, never drawing attention to himself. He would sit at a corner table, usually in the same spot, order a simple meal, and leave before the rush. He never spoke much to anyone, except to Sarah, and even then, their conversations were always brief. He seemed content to watch from the sidelines, helping when he could, but never demanding recognition. To everyone in the diner, he was just another customer, a man who had shown kindness when Sarah had needed it most. It wasn't until one ordinary afternoon that Sarah's world would be turned upside down once more. The letter came without warning. It was delivered to the diner with a small seal, the kind of envelope she never thought she'd see. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Frank's neat, precise script. With a mix of curiosity and apprehension, Sarah opened the letter, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the paper. The words inside were simple, but they held the weight of years of secrets, struggles, and sacrifices. Sarah, if you are reading this, then I have already disappeared from your life. I've always preferred to stay in the shadows, but I owe you an explanation. You see, everything I did for the diner was not out of obligation or charity. It was because of you. When I first walked into your diner that rainy night, I didn't expect much. But what I found was more than just a meal. You gave me more than food. You gave me kindness, and that's something that has been rare in my life. My family's wealth was built on lies and deceit, and the fallout from the scandal that ruined our name left me with nothing but a reputation I couldn't escape. I walked away from it all, choosing to rebuild my life in a way that felt true to who I am. But over time, I realized that what I had been looking for all along wasn't more money or success. It was redemption. I had been secretly investing in your diner not because I wanted control, but because I wanted to see it succeed, to see it thrive under your guidance. The legacy of my family was built on a broken foundation, but in you, I saw the chance for something different. Something built on integrity, hard work, and compassion. You've done more than bring the diner back to life. You've given it meaning. I hope that one day you'll understand the full extent of what I've done. Know that every penny I gave, every investment I made was not for me. It was for you. It was for the future of the diner and for the community that you've created here. I leave behind not just money but a gift. The knowledge that kindness can heal wounds and that second chances are real. My family's wealth, once a symbol of greed, has been used to help restore something far more valuable, the heart of your diner. Please don't try to find me. I've already found what I needed in you. With respect and gratitude, Frank. As Sarah read through the letter, a flood of emotions overwhelmed her. The revelation that Frank had been the one silently funding her diner's operation for months was a shock, but it was nothing compared to the truth about his motivations. Frank hadn't just been trying to make up for his family's past sins. He had been giving because he respected the goodness she had shown him on that rainy night. He hadn't wanted anything in return. He had simply wanted to see her succeed, to see her live out the dream she had shared with her late husband. For a moment, Sarah was speechless. The weight of the letter hung heavily in her hands, but as she processed the words, something else started to settle in her heart. Gratitude. Frank had shown her the true meaning of second chances, not just for himself, but for her and the diner. She sat down in the same booth where they had shared their first brief conversation, the one she had thought of so often since. The place had changed so much, yet in a way it was still the same. It was still the place where kindness and community had come together to heal the wounds of the past. Sarah folded the letter carefully, placing it in her purse, and took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The diner was more than just a business now. It was a living, breathing testament to the power of redemption. Frank's involvement had not only helped her rebuild the diner, it had helped her rebuild her belief in people, in kindness, and in the possibility of new beginnings. The future looked brighter than it had in years. The diner had become an institution in the city, a place where everyone, from the wealthiest to the humblest, felt welcome. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was a community hub, a place where people came to connect, share stories, and find comfort in a meal. And Sarah, with her unshakable dedication to the values her husband had taught her, had turned the diner into a lasting legacy. As time passed, the diner continued to flourish. New families came to the city, bringing with them their own stories and traditions, and the diner became a place where they could create new memories. Sarah's family thrived, and her children, who had grown up watching their mother pour her heart into the diner, had decided to join her in running the business. The cycle of hard work, community, and love continued, just as it had for years. Frank, though he had never come forward to reveal his true identity, had left behind a legacy far more powerful than wealth. He had given Sarah the chance to rebuild, to grow, and to make a difference in the lives of others. His quiet support had sparked something in her, a belief that no matter how difficult life could be, kindness was always worth it. And so, Sarah's diner, once struggling and forgotten, became a beloved institution, a testament to the power of second chances, the strength of community, and the enduring impact of a single act of kindness on a rainy night. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more heartwarming tales to life. If you'd like to support us even further, feel free to leave a super thanks and consider joining our channel for exclusive content and perks. Thanks for watching, and remember, the power of kindness can change lives, just like it did in this story.